Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. A warm welcome back to the CHA Annual Conference 2021. My name is Ralf Südhoff. I'm the director of the Center for Humanitarian Action, and I'm really happy that you are back to our second day of our conference centered on the question 5 years, Grand Bargain and World Humanitarian Summit, time to restart humanitarian reform. We had yesterday intense discussions with really interesting, inspiring guests like Smruti Patel and Klaus Sørensen, the former DG ECHO Director General, and we deep dived into localization issues and the future role of NGOs in the humanitarian world. And so we took a close look already on one of the top priority areas of a potential future Grand Bargain, which is to be rediscussed in a few weeks' time. And localization might be a top area to further look into progress and how more progress could be achieved. And today we want to look into the second priority area, which might be in the focus of the Grand Bargain 2.0, which is so-called quality funding, and how could funding better enable humanitarian reform and much more effective aid. Before we jump into this, let me give you a quick sense of what's coming after that. We will have in the follow-up 3, as we called it, spotlight sessions, looking 30 minutes each on a couple of cross-cutting issues. One, Grand Bargain and gender. The second, how ready is the humanitarian system for innovation? And the third important one, the ethics of humanitarian reform, as we keep talking a lot for good reasons about efficiency, about effectiveness, but there is also underlying values and principles, and what's the right balance for that. For now, we would like to look, as said, however, in the topic of quality funding and how donors could progress faster, asking if the reform drivers of this Grand Bargain might be at the same time the blockers of reform. As shared yesterday, the Grand Bargain has basically been a deal. It has been a deal of donors providing more trust into aid agencies in their work, and that they deliver value for money for which they would provide more transparency, that what they do is achieving the jointly agreed goals. For this, donors promised at the World Humanitarian Summit 2016 to provide far more multi-year funding, also in the light that we live in an era of protracted crisis. The Syria war is going into its 11th year, but also Somalia, South Sudan, DR Congo have well passed the 20 years mark in these emergencies. And they would provide more flexible funding to allow aid agencies to agree, for example, in the pandemic right now, where are the funds really most urgently needed, and to provide at least 30% of their funding in a flexible way. Aid agencies themselves can decide what is the most important way forward. So this morning, we would like to discuss for a start in our keynote dialogue if the top 2 donor, the world's top two donor today, Germany, has delivered on this promise, and how other international donors have done so. And for this, you are also invited to join us in a few minutes already in the chat, in Zoom. Please, you can share your views and comments. And when we will have discussed with Sibylle Sorg, the Director General of the Foreign Office in Germany, the German approach, why follow this, and I will later introduce to you the panel following with the top think tank on the Grand Bargain, the Humanitarian Policy Group in London, and we are really happy that the Director, CHA O'Callaghan, is with us today. And then we will hear from an NGO perspective and a truly local perspective from Bangladesh, from START Director Sajid Raihan, how he sees the role of donors, why such quality funding is really crucial, but also how NGOs are perform as they are often donors themselves. So let me jump into this and introduce to you Sibylle Sorg. We are really happy to have with us this morning. She's the highest working level in the German Foreign Office. She is not only responsible for humanitarian affairs, but also for crisis prevention, stabilization, and peace building, and has strong leadership experience. You've been with the former Minister Steinmeier in his office for a couple of years. You have a strong regional background, also a conflict background in the Middle East. And you are into the humanitarian world since more or less a year, I believe, Sibylle Sorg. So could you share with us your view? 2016, there have been at least 2 schools on what kind of humanitarian reform is needed. There has been the rather fundamental view saying, well, we really needed fundamental change. I shared yesterday the wording of Valerie Amos, OCHA director, saying, well, the humanitarian system needs to reform or it will die. And there has been the different approach saying, well, let's not forget the system is pretty effective, it is delivering, but we need some reforms. As you had a fresh look starting 2020, what's your impression? What's been your view and what has been your take on the Grand Bargain so far? Good morning and welcome to our conference.
Thank you very, very much, and it's a pleasure to be with you. I have to say that after 8 months in this job, I continue to be impressed, first of all, by the international humanitarian system, what it can deliver and what it can do. And specifically impressed I'm by the humanitarian workers, by their efforts, by their dedication. Really strong and tremendous work alleviating suffering and helping people in needs. I think this service cannot be overestimated, and I'm impressed by it really every day. That's one very strong feature. The other very strong feature is when I started, I was, of course, confronted straight away with the fact that the humanitarian system is under historic strains and that the funding gap is growing and not getting smaller. And my role was to help to secure the necessary funding on the German side with the help of the federal parliament. So I was confronted with, I think, the overarching problem we have, that we have to make our money last longer in the humanitarian system, at the same time a rather deep. So it became quite clear that the system itself has to try to improve itself, to get better, to see how it can optimize the own instruments, how innovation can be brought in. And you started your question and introduction for me with the question after reform, the need for reform. And I followed, of course, the discussion very closely and saw that the people in the system are constantly striving to find the best way forward. And of that, but asked what I would prefer, a step-by-step reform within the system or a fundamental reform, my reaction today would be it's the right approach to try a step-by-step reform, because fundamental reform always comes with a cost. You take the risk of getting into a phase where you disrupt important processes that are constantly needed to help the people in need. And the humanitarian system, I think, has a task that cannot be put down for only one day. So the reform has to be careful, and it has to take place within the system. That would be my first reaction. So the system, in a way, is in a situation where it has to optimize itself, and the Grand Bargain has to take on this area of expertise and has to bring it forward.
Many thanks for this intro. If we look at the progress so far past 5 years and take it from a CHA paper we've just published on the progress of the Grand Bargain after 5 years, we would surely agree that rather, let's say, a step-by-step approach has been taken, resulting in a lot of pilot projects having started, some programs having been at scale to some extent. But there is a lot of talk about, well, we haven't really changed progress. We haven't really seen systematic change in many areas, including the ones where Germany had some success stories to share. Would you agree that there is much more needed, even on the side Germany has made progress on? I'm hearing Frau Sorg, Director General, is jumped off the web, unfortunately. So let's see if we can get her back within a few seconds. Might be the Foreign Office line, as the line was broken in between very briefly already. So let's see if she can rejoin us in a second. Gives me time for some advertisement. I mentioned already our policy paper. So please take a look. We published it a few days ago in English and German. And for the quick reader, there is also a 10 thesis summary. So if this takes 2 minutes, you can even read the executive summary in that time. But I hope after that we can rejoin. Otherwise, we would probably jump into the panel in a second. So let's see if we can rebuild the connection. Surely a key issue for us has been, when you looked in the paper, that the challenges have been on many donor sides, that the delivery on the commitments, for example, to provide 30% of flexible funding, only less than half of government donors at least have really shared concrete results and have achieved this after 5 years, which is of course a bit disappointing. Adding a bit some housekeeping, because probably I should have mentioned from the beginning that you can have further discussions yourself also on Slack. If you want to register on Slack, this gives you the opportunity not only to chat during this session, but also afterwards, after the conference, even to network you and to see what's the outcomes of this conference and how you want to approach even the Grand Bargain conference in June. If we can't get back Frau Sorg in a second, I would propose we bring Sorcha O'Callaghan into the debate, as this was the plan anyhow, to bring her in as long as Sibylle Sorg can be with us for the keynote dialogue. I hear Sibylle Sorg is back, so I should have probably threatened to move on before to give some incentive to the web. But let's try. Director General Sorg, can you hear me?
I can hear you. I don't know what the problem is, but sometimes you are freezing in front of me, and I cannot take part any longer. So let's try to use the time we have for the next
Right.
interchange.
Perfect. Same here. Maybe the line at the other end was freezing for some reason as well. But we heard you almost until the very end, I believe. What I tried to share as a question is, would you agree to, for example, CHA analysis that many success stories Germany also has inspired in the Grand Bargain have been still rather on a pilot project level and not really changed processes and structures so far? Is that a fair summary, or what would you analyze if you look at Germany for a start?
Yeah. Look, I think the assessment would be that the Grand Bargain is, in a way, a success. A lot has been achieved, but of course, we are not at the end of the journey. More needs to follow, that's for sure. But if you want to look at what has been achieved, I would say that there has been a significant shift to a more efficient system. For example, if you take cash assistance, if you take harmonized reporting, if you take quality funding, I can certainly see progress in these areas. But the humanitarian system is a huge enterprise, so it takes time, and that means that we need to continue our work. We've taken part in all the different work streams of the Grand Bargain, and we think that specifically the progress that has been made in flexible funding is one that has to be highlighted. From our German perspective, we were able to increase the share of flexible funding in our overall humanitarian assistance to 37% for the first time. That's a huge step. And the other huge step we could take was that over the course of the Grand Bargain, we could increase our multi-year funding from 25 to 64%. Having said that, you were asking about pilots and programs and whether we are already perhaps one step further coming from pilot projects to real implementation. I would say that processes in the humanitarian system really do change, and new approaches do become institutionalized. Let's take our example in the work stream we were leading on, that was the introduction of harmonized and simplified reporting. It was not an easy start we had in this work stream. Yeah? We had a 2-year pilot phase, and it was really challenging to sell the idea across the board of the humanitarian system. But after a lot of advocating, we were able to see to really trigger the shift we wanted to see. If we look at it at this moment in time, we have OCHA, UNHCR, UNICEF, WFP, the USA, Germany, the Netherlands, and Switzerland using our reporting template, the 8+3 template. What I want to say by that is it is a slow progress, but there is progress. And now we are in the implementing phase, and we are trying to get more people on board. Let me say one other word on the multi-year funding, because you asked about the process. At the beginning, it was relatively easy for us to introduce multi-year funding. Reducing our earmarking proved much more challenging for us. So for us, it was always interesting to test these new approaches first and then come to the next step. The response to COVID-19 was a real catalyst in that area, because it made clear to everybody how important flexible funding, important it is that we learn from that and introduce and implement it much stronger in the future. So we have transitioned from testing to increasingly using flexible funding. I only want to point to the different regional funds, the pooled funds, the newly introduced regional pooled fund for Central and Western Africa, country-based funds. So these enable us to be swift and flexible. And these funds are drivers to change in itself. So again, I can only say there is progress, but we are not at the end of the story. We have to keep up our efforts in that regard.
Many things, maybe choosing the topic of pooled funds, and if we take this example, and there has been substantial progress, and Germany has increased its funding for pooled funds, which are supposed to be more flexible, who can be pretty localized on the country level, etc. At the same time, the goal to share at least 15% of funding to pooled funds, Germany hasn't achieved itself. If we look at the multi-year funding, the figures shared by the Foreign Office are very impressive. At the same time, it's very hard to analyze where these funds have gone to and to recheck, if you know what I mean. Or if we look at the issue of transparency itself, the reporting where Germany is committing its funding to which countries, to which crisis, only coming every 4th or 5th year. Would you say there is more scope for improvement, that the benchmark for transparency and these commitments hasn't been achieved yet? And if so, what is holding the ministry back? Why can't Germany play a more advancing role in these areas? I hear Sibylle Sorg has left us again, so maybe let's see what she could hear and if we can get her back. I mean, it seems at our end it's fine. Frau Sorg, I hear you are coming back and the web might be back at your And
yes, I am back. I think.
okay.
So I can answer the questions you were asking because I heard the question
Oh, very good.
before it froze.
Okay.
Very well. Look, transparency, the key word transparency. You know that we are reporting very intensely about our humanitarian assistance and how we spend it. In the EATI, in IDRIS, in FTS. At the same time, I understand that we are not at this moment in time in a position to have a reporting that from day one shows where we are standing at a certain moment in time. But what I would suggest is, if you look at the amount of money we are the pooled funds, or that we are putting into the SERF, where we are the biggest national donor, I think you see a growing tendency. Wherever we can, we increase the number of funding or the amount of funding we put into pooled funds. When we co-hosted the Sahel Humanitarian Conference last October, we put a lot of emphasis on introducing and bringing to life a new regional fund that helps to react across borders in the Sahel region to the arising needs in the different affected countries. So there is a tendency of increase of our means in these instruments, and that I think is a good development.
Many thanks. I hope you can keep hearing me. Maybe a final question from my side before, if you don't mind, I would invite Sorg from the Humanitarian Policy Group to share a comment or question, as she is the lead of reporting on the 5 years Grand Bargain progress, and we know that then you will have to leave pretty soon. One of the key asks for a future Grand Bargain to be agreed in June is that we need more political momentum, more dynamic again on the highest level. 5 years ago, Chancellor Merkel even attended the World Humanitarian Summit when the Grand Bargain has been agreed. For now, sometimes the critics say, well, even the leadership of the Foreign Office might not have the same priority for humanitarian reform as, or for the humanitarian sector, as would be needed. Can you not hear me? Okay, then I bring in Sorg at this point, if that's possible. For some reason, I think within Berlin to the Foreign Office, the line seems to be worse than globally to Bangladesh and London. Hi, Sorg. Sorry for surprising you at this point.
Hi, Ralph.
But
no
somehow,
problem at all. Let's hope the line works.
Okay.
It's London, and yeah, impressive number of participants tuning in early in the morning for Europe anyway to talk about the Grand Bargain. So delighted to be here.
Many thanks, Sorg, and I will introduce you properly after this keynote dialogue. Frau Sorg, you are back. I just brought in Sorg, maybe to invite her for a quick comment while the line to the Foreign Office has been re-established. Sorg, how would you see the role of Germany in the Grand Bargain? Is there any ask from your side what you would see or love to see from the German side?
Good morning, Frau Sorg, and nice to be here. One thing that strikes me is that over the lifetime of the Grand Bargain, Germany has moved into being, the second largest humanitarian donor. That is fantastic, and I think there's a lot of criticism around quality funding, but perhaps Germany has done better than some in that respect. And I think from our perspective in HPG, we see the largest donors as being fundamental to really altering the picture on quality funding. There's been good progress amongst the smaller donors, but we need the larger donors to make moves. I guess looking back, I think that perhaps Germany hasn't matched some of its advances on funding with really prioritizing and taking leadership on policy change. And I guess as you go into now Grand Bargain 2.0, what would you like to see, Frau Sorg, in terms of outcomes from that process? And where would you see Germany taking a leadership role? So it's matching its advances on financing and on funding with real policy leadership.
Many thanks, Sorg. Frau Sorg, would you like to jump in?
Thank you very much, and I hope the line will hold towards the end. Look, I think that the Grand Bargain 2.0, how it is called, is at this moment in time in a phase where the different partners that are participating are preparing to put emphasis, and there's growing consensus on among the signatories that we need to have the clear focus on localization and quality funding in the future. That is, I think, quite clear. And at this moment in time, other aspects that come into the picture additionally are gender and risk. At this moment in time, the facilitation group, the co-conveners of the work streams, and others who are trying to put more flesh on these areas. But I have to say that the Grand Bargain 2.0 is more on implementing pre-existing commitments than on inventing new far-reaching areas. And I think it's right, because there is a lot to do still on goals from 2016. We will certainly use our leverage with regard to the policy to put more emphasis on innovation, because we feel that this is an area where, in addition to the classical Grand Bargain headlines, we have to offer a whole lot to make this, to optimize the system and help to make the system more efficient. At the same time, I think our own situation with regard to quality funding and flexible funding is not that easy. We have seen, for example, that the need for visibility and timely indicative reporting on the impact and allocation of flexible funding was an aspect that hindered progress within the Grand Bargain. Because in times of tight budget, we, as a major donor, we need to be in a position where we can clearly demonstrate to our parliament and to the wider public that our means are well spent. And this is a kind of balance we have to strike all the time. We want to be more flexible, but we have to rely on the partners within the UN system and NGOs to provide us back with all the information we need to make our case in the political sphere. Yeah? And I think another area that was a hindrance to us to make more progress was cascading the benefits of quality funding to the local partners under the headline of localization and of risk sharing between donors and humanitarian organizations. That needs also to be addressed to further improve the system, because localization, one of our major goals to become better in that area, is really extremely complicated for us because we are not on the ground as a government. And we have budgetary laws that really limit our
Sibylle Sorg again. Sorg, many thanks for this crucial question you shared. Any comments on the feedback of the Director General? I mean, for a start, localization surely is for all of us a challenge. How would you comment on the feedback on donor commitment in this regard and with respect to quality funding? Oh, we have to unmute. Okay. Now we can hear you, I believe.
Okay. Yes, I mean, I guess the answer for me was implicit in the question. And I think we have seen advances from Germany, and Frau Sorg mentioned them herself in terms of increased flexible funding and increased multi-year funding. We've seen Germany take a real policy lead in terms of anticipatory financing, but I think what would be great now for the next year, 2 years of the Grand Bargain, to see, that level of policy commitment from Germany. We heard from Frau Sorg that local humanitarian action is a policy priority. So what can we expect to see from Germany in respect of that? And how can they use quality funding as a way perhaps of ensuring more institutional funding for local actors? How can they push their partners, UN partners, but also NGO partners, to ensure that some of this flexibility that they're affording, perhaps at the macro level, is reaching local actors? The constraints that she mentioned in terms of transparency, in terms of visibility, in terms of providing assurances to Parliament and to taxpayers in Germany, that's not unique to Germany. That's a challenge, and that's a tension that each donor has to grapple with. And it's certainly very important, but how to work within those constraints to move forward on these commitments. And we can come to it later, but I think what we've really seen is that there is a need to move perhaps away from this, as you called it, Ralph, a deal, where it's a quid pro quo, where donors move and then aid actors move, and we're in these kind of constituency groups where each is almost waiting for the other to make a move. And can we move towards more of an alliance where we see champions on specific issues really driving through change and not really waiting for the other side to make a change? What can we do to get champions working together to drive to change? So we'd really like to see Germany taking on that mantle, given that it's now the second largest donor. And, we heard a lot yesterday about the US now, perhaps politically being a little bit of a constraint on change over the last few years, and that there was an opportunity for the US to move forward. I would argue that Germany is in a similar position, and we see with, FCDO has been playing an important policy role in relation to the Grand Bargain, is perhaps more constrained currently. And so there's an opportunity and a space, I think, for Germany to play a more significant role.
Many thanks, Sorcha. As I'm not sure if we can re-establish the line to the Foreign Office, which is actually 300 meters from here. Let's continue, and it's overdue to properly introduce you, Sorcha. You're a lawyer, you're the director of the Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI. You've been very much into protected crisis. You know the British Red Cross from your past, as well as the NGO world, for example, coordinating the Sudan Advocacy Coalition. So you have such a broad horizon, and HPG, your think tank, has been in the lead for 5 years to report year by year independently on the progress of the Grand Bargain. So there's a lot to share, I'm sure, from your analysis, especially on quality funding. But maybe if we take one step back for now, if you try to remember 5 years ago, what have been your hopes related to the summit, and what have been your expectations, and why was there such a need for reform from your view? I think you have muted yourself again, or we have to unmute you. Can you?
I think,
yes,
yeah,
perfect.
I think someone keeps muting me, so maybe I can stop, because
okay.
I'm not able to keep unmuting myself. I think like everyone, and you mentioned it yourself, we were all hoping for huge transformation, and we went into the World Humanitarian Summit with incredibly high hopes. And there was a focus on conflict and on protection and on principles, on ending need. And I think over the course of that process, and it was obvious, I think, coming up to that process, when there wasn't political participation, that we weren't really going to get the level of political engagement that would have provided perhaps some of the transformation that all of us was looking for. And I think what emerged out was something much more constrained, so a focus on efficiency and effectiveness within the system, rather than really thinking through actually what can we do to prevent and tackle conflict and their effects on civilians. How do we put people at the center of humanitarian action? And that is an agenda, I think, that's been really missing, and that we haven't seen progress or sufficient progress over the last 5 years. So I think that kind of hoped for transformation and that groundswell of optimism is what we all hope for. And I think we still see it and hear it now in terms of the continued calls for a reset of the humanitarian system, one that's more equal, one that's more anticipatory, that works earlier on conflict, and is better at engaging with development or peace actors. But I think that optimism and that hope and that focus on transformation has in some ways dogged the grand bargain, because I think all those hopes were then transferred into this quite technical process of reform. And those hopes were pinned on this process. I think there's different views on the grand bargain, but personally, I feel that the grand bargain can achieve step-by-step reform, as you mentioned, and that may lead to real change over time. But we also need to continue to have that real push for transformation. And I think that transformation of the system needs to happen in tandem. And I think that will come from outside the grand bargain process, and can push the grand bargain process in terms of being more ambitious and achieving greater results.
Many things. It will be really interesting to discuss later on where you think the push for further reform could come from. Maybe in a nutshell, if we stick to the grand bargain overall for one more minute, if you would need to name one key achievement within the grand bargain process and maybe one top failure, what would be your takes? Any views?
Yeah, I mean, I think one achievement, actually, and it's not spoken about that much, but I think that kind of the grand bargain as a forum where you have donors, UN organizations, international organizations, and to a certain degree now national actors as well, engaging and making decisions as relative equals. I think that's a unique forum. You don't see it anywhere else in the system. And I think that's one of its strengths. But as I said earlier, it's also one of its limits, because you have, also the vested interests of those different actors, the most powerful humanitarian actors, and they won't vote to really upend the system that they're participating in, and certainly not kind of over 5 years. Everyone points to cash as the big achievement, and I think what's interesting there, I think we all agree that it was a great achievement, but I think what were the conditions that allowed the success on cash? And I think there we had a clarity of purpose. The case had been made, before 2016, HPG was part of it, but so many others were part of making an evidence-based case for change. So we went into the grand bargain already with a common purpose and a clarity of purpose. And we saw the interests of donors and aid organizations converging on this agenda, and they used their respective points of leverage to catalyze. So the change didn't happen within the grand bargain, but the grand bargain was a catalytic and kind of complementary process for cash. So I think what we can draw from that is that kind of clarity of purpose, convergence of interest, political will, and investment from donors. And I think that's what's been lacking perhaps in other areas. And even the cash work stream itself, where there's been difficulty in terms of the cash coordination mechanism, and it's needed political decision making, you see that actually kind of the vested interests of different actors mean that it hasn't, we haven't been able to get a resolution of that to date. So it brings me to places where there's been less success. I think work stream 4 on reducing duplication and management cost, where I think there hasn't been, a clear clarity of purpose and a common agenda. There hasn't been that commitment from different actors, and in particular, there's been a lack of donor attention, and it means that this work stream, I think, in particular, has failed to deliver on its original ambition. I think you could, also argue that while there's been real energy and emphasis on local action and the localization workstream, as it's called, and on, to a certain degree, on participation, I think what we don't have, I think there's been important political focus on those two agendas, and localization much more than participation. But we haven't had that kind of real commitment and that real kind of drivers of change. And I hope that that can happen in the next iteration of the Grand Bargain. I think it's really important that even though we haven't seen that same momentum, I think the case has been made to a certain degree through the Grand Bargain for localization. We went in to the Grand Bargain 5 years ago with this being a kind of an agenda that was being pushed. I think the case has been made now for localization, and we have Germany saying, that it's a policy priority. We have Australia, it being their #1 policy priority. The UK is making some commitments in relation to localization. Denmark, a number of donors are really now saying they want to move this forward. Mm-hmm. And I think that wasn't the case 5 years ago. Hopefully we can now get momentum on localization in a way that we haven't had to date.
Many things. Maybe quickly jumping only on the example of reporting, assessments, bureaucracy on the donor side. If we take the example of donor assessments and individual donor assessments, which is a major issue in terms of bureaucracy for aid actors, for example, especially by the British government and the European Commission, there has been a promise to decrease these individual assessments, meaning that governments send teams and ask for independent evaluations of the needs on the ground of the operations and NGOs operating, etc., and sending these teams and these processes again and again to the operational level, and each government doing it on its own, versus agreeing, which was the promise, on joint assessments, as the questions, of course, are pretty much the same. At the same time, we see this very governments pushing for these reforms, like the British and the European Commission, have doubled the number of individual assessments over the course of past years. If we take this tiny example, how come there is such a gap between the commitment and the overarching goal versus maybe an accountability debate, believing, well, we have to follow up on our own, we have to fix this on our own, and we can't really stick to what we have promised 5 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an important question, and we heard from Frau Sorg in terms of her constraints that she has in terms of ensuring that there was visibility and an ability to report back to domestic publics and parliaments on what Germany was funding. And I think that relates back to this need for needs assessment. But I think there has been some progress on that in terms of a kind of a common needs assessment, but certainly I think that's an area that there will need to be more progress in over the coming period. And I think what's been helpful in terms of I guess what the focus is on Grand Bargain 2.0, if some of the thinking that's happening at the moment is materializes, is that there's a recognition that these areas overlap, and that you can't make progress on just one area if you want to make progress on quality funding, which is going to be, I think, the central focus of at least one of the objectives in the next iteration of the Grand Bargain, that these issues can't be tackled in isolation. Quality funding does require kind of movement on needs assessment. And I think there has been, some progress on joint needs analysis. But there is a requirement, as you say, for donors to come together around that and make sure that the assessment tool is actually used by a number of different donors, and they're not making the demands, as you say, which creates such inefficiencies and bureaucracies.
Many thanks for this overview already. Maybe jumping on the topic of quality funding of governments for now and moving a bit beyond the German role. If you can share with us in a few weeks' time, you will share your final analysis of the Grand Bargain progress also on this front. What's your take? What has been the progress if you look into the international donor world?
So on quality funding, I mean, I think one of the things to say there is that, it's an area where I think there's real frustration and a sense that, this process has been blocked. And we do have to remember that, there were two separate work streams and then they were brought together. And so there's been a lot of kind of discussions through the Grand Bargain, especially in the first 2 to 3 years. And I think many aid organisations feel that they've done their bit, that they've increased the quality and the granularity of their reporting, they've increased transparency, and it's time for donors in particular to move faster and move further. But if I go back to what we were talking about in terms of cash and some of the conditions for rapid change, one of them is this kind of clarity. And I think what we've seen and what Frau Sorg pointed to as well is that, we can talk about quality funding, but it's actually much more complex than we originally envisaged. And each donor has a slightly different set of parameters that they need to deal with. They will need to manage these kind of risks and accountabilities in slightly different ways, depending on their own context and their own administrations. And so there isn't one single solution across the system. And I think that then plays into kind of the level of momentum and the level of change. And we're in a situation now, which I would say is possibly more difficult to where we were in 2016, where there's greater scrutiny of aid budgets, and we're facing a global recession. So many donors are fighting to retain the levels and the scope of funding that's currently available. And I think many donors, despite aid organizations' rhetoric of transparency, that actually that talk hasn't really been matched with reality. And so there's still some way to go to ensure the trust of donors on how aid is spent, particularly, I think, amongst some of the larger agencies. And so I guess they're the kind of, that's the environment that we're in. And I think perhaps also worth mentioning, and we'll say this in the annual independent report this year, that although progress has been slow, there is some progress being made, and perhaps more actually than people perceive. I think the issue here is that the real progress is often made amongst the smaller donors. And so you see Netherlands really as a standout performer in terms of its increasing in multi-year and flexible funding over the 5-year period. Belgium has reported it's made substantial increases in the volume of flexible funding, which is now at about 68%. We heard from Germany, Ireland, and other, the Nordic donors as well have made significant moves over the past 5 years. I think the difficulty is that some of the larger donors, and I guess the US and ECHO in particular here, haven't made that level of transformative change. And therefore, as a percentage, the shift in quality funding hasn't been that dramatic. And you therefore see, for instance, WFP which is a really large recipient of funding, says that the kind of the percentage of their funding and their quality funding hasn't changed. And UNHCR, for instance, is seeing a decrease. And so what we heard from Frau Sorg in terms of the movement that Germany has made, we really need to see the larger donors making those types of changes in order to affect the overall picture. And in that respect, while US and ECHO have perhaps not moved as much, there are some promising signs. And so for the first time, ECHO contributed to country-based pool funds, and it began new program partnerships with some NGOs. And so this kind of demonstrates new, small changes, but important and significant ones. And the US also made some progress in terms of increasing the proportion of flexible funding. And I guess lastly, just in terms of COVID, there's been a real suggestion that there was a backslide in terms of quality funding during COVID. But actually what we saw is, at least in the early days of the pandemic, there was greater flexibility amongst the donors towards the UN agencies. And I think that's important. Which allowed existing funds to be reprogrammed, allowed flexible funding, flexible reporting and administration, and a real swift agreement of funding. And so, while this didn't perhaps kind of trickle down through the system and the same level of flexibility wasn't afforded to NGOs, these are the types of things that we really need to scale up and make sure that there isn't a reversal on now that perhaps COVID isn't kind of at the emergency phase, to ensure that there is system-wide progress on quality funding. Because at the moment, what we're seeing is, some development among some, particularly smaller donors, but we really need to see now system-wide change where the larger donors in particular are making advances, and some of the flexibility that we saw in relation to COVID is demonstrated kind of more widely across the system.
Many thanks, Sorg, for these deep insights into especially government donor approaches and where we stand with that. We will surely come back to you later when we talk also about other actors. You named already UN agencies. The major international NGOs are donors themselves and transmitters of donor funding. So let's move maybe on to the NGO world, and I'm more than happy to introduce our other panelists. Welcome. Good morning or good afternoon in your case to Bangladesh, Sajid Raihan. Can you hear us? Good morning and welcome to our conference.
I hear you, Rolf. Good morning and good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Sajid. You are the country manager of the START Fund, an NGO network and pooled fund providing assistance in Bangladesh and worldwide. You are the country director for the START Fund and a truly local representative being from Bangladesh. And you manage this since 2017 before you've been with ActionAid and other NGOs. So you have really a broad NGO perspective to share with us, and that's extremely helpful if we talk about quality funding. So many thanks for joining us. And maybe, Sajid, for a start, you could share with us a bit, why is this flexible funding, this multi-year funding, this quality funding, as we call it, why is it so crucial from a local perspective, and what are the downsides if it's not provided? Now you've been unmuted. You've muted, but you need to be unmuted again.
Yeah.
Perfect.
Yeah.
We can hear you.
Yeah. So thank you very much again, for inviting START Fund Bangladesh. So what we understood from the last 4 years of our operations in Bangladesh as a pool funding mechanism, some of the quality funding criteria or indicators that we really feel that's coming from the local organizations. The local organizations really wish to see a kind of funding which attracts and maintain qualified human resources in their organizations. These are kind of unearmarked overhead costs so that those can be used for management, future institutional development of the organizations. And the existing organizational systems are not disrupted but it's reinforced. There is no extra conditions added from the donor. It encourages and enables direct contract between local national agencies and donors. The funds are co-managed and it's accessible directly by the local NGOs. Donor encourage proposals in line with the localization commitments. It's risk facing, risk sharing, and not at all risk averting. So the local organizations really wish to understand what are the risks and really wish to share their risk and also face the challenges alongside with governments, donors, and NGOs. It has to be flexible, it has to be multi-year financing, and it should not be projectized. And so that it provides space for innovation. And then again, I mean, as we are always saying, there are issues around harmonized reporting, accounting, and mail procedures and formats between different international agencies while they are collaborating with local national organizations. And they do not have to go through DDA for every time they access a new fund. So I think these are some of the reflections from the local organizations in terms of the quality.
Thanks, Sajid. I mean, Bangladesh seems to be a really interesting example, given that I understand like 25% of the humanitarian funding provided in Bangladesh is going directly to local actors, which is quite substantial. And the START network has an approach which ensures even about 70–80% of your funding, I understand, is going directly to local partners. Why are things going apparently more successful? Why is it different in Bangladesh? What's been the practical way to achieve this?
Well, so let me start with a bit of background on the START network, and I think that will bring us to the answer. So START network is made up of more than 58 agencies currently across 5 continents. Yes. And the aim is to transform humanitarian actions through innovation, fast funding, early action, and localization. So back in 2014, it was the fund was operated by the network membership and drawing on a single global disbursement pot for emergency response projects globally. And during then, there was a realization that it was not aligned with the START Fund's overall aim to be decentralized, diverse, collaborative ecosystem of civil society organizations. And also there are widespread perception of the START network identity as the ultimately British one. So side by side, there was also a demand for the START Fund model at the national level. And in fact, that demand led to the development of the START Fund Bangladesh as the pilot initiative of START network. So it's the first pilot initiative, and it's developed with the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office UK in 2017. And we started with 20 START network member NGOs in Bangladesh, but then within 1.5 year, we onboarded around 26 local national organizations on board. So currently we have 47 members. And we have an executive committee, which is 6 from the NGOs and 7 from local national NGOs. All the members have equal participation and decision-making and equal access to funding. Now, if I come to the kind of, START network, its reform agenda, so we can see that clearly, if we look at the new strategy, that during the last 2 years, START network initiated 5 new hubs in different locations in country and region. So those are the Pakistan, India, DRC, Guatemala, and the Pacific. And in 2020, the network already onboarded 12 local national NGOs from these 5 hubs as network members, meaning that they will be part of the governance, decision-making, and will have direct access to fund. So this year, there are also initiatives to onboard 5 more hubs so that we increase the number of hubs and increase the representation at the global level. It takes time because these are not projectized or piecemeal basis. And the target is that at least 50% of the hub's membership will be local organizations. So hub is very much at the center of the current strategy of START network. And the network is gradually transforming itself to a service providing platforms. And if you look at some of the upcoming design of the START network, so we are talking about START financing facility, which will be governed by the hub's members, the local national organizations and international organizations together at the international level. So how much of the funds will be allocated to which country will be defined and will be decided by members themselves.
Many thanks, Sajid. I understand the key advantage of your approach in Bangladesh is that there is truly local participation in all the forums and all the decision-making processes to ensure you have also accountability to the ones the system is supposed to serve. So pooled funds can be a major step, and it might be disappointing to you that funding for pooled funds hasn't reached the 15% mark the grand bargain promised. But may I ask you at the same time, there's a lot of talk about what pooled funds are delivering. If we take the other example of the UN-managed pooled funds, the country-based pooled funds, they share for some time now something like 26% of the funds they have with local partners. We've heard this impressive success in Bangladesh of the START network, while globally the START fund hasn't shared much funding with local partners in the past, which I understand was one point of critique to start this reform process. So what is especially then such an NGO network holding back, or what has held it back in the past, to progress faster on the localization front and to perform better and not worse than many of the much criticized government donors?
Thank you, Rolf. So, I mean, what is happening in START Fund Bangladesh is also a learning for START Network, and also START Network is looking into kind of how this can be kind of operationalized, or where and how we can organize the structures in other countries so that we can do the same kind of success at different countries. So START Fund Bangladesh has proved that ambitious commitments such as the one set in the Grand Bargain can be implemented and delivered. The fund has delivered on at least 3 of the 6 commitments under Grand Bargain Workstream 2 on localization, namely understand better and work to reduce barriers that prevent local national responders direct access to humanitarian aid, support and complement national coordination mechanism and include local and national responders in national coordination mechanism. And then 55% of the total START Fund Bangladesh funding going directly channeled to local and national NGOs. And in 2020 alone, the figure was around 80%. And which is also resulting to reduced duplication and management cost, which complements Workstream 4. It also ensured that more money going to affected communities and reaching faster due to reduced fundamentaries and transaction layers. So, I mean, in terms of the operation and management cost, we have seen that it has been reduced by 15% compared to the stats before 2017. And time to reach communities reduced by 35%. So definitely localization and this kind of pool funding mechanism has a lot to offer. Mm-hmm. If we also look into more direct access means also more ICR for local actors and their agencies, and it can really facilitate organizational development and can also build sustainability of civil society organizations. So from 2019 till 2020, we have seen that the sharing of ICR between international members who access the fund and the local partners stood at 73% to 27%, and which is around more than £21,000 that's going to local partner only in the last 1 year. And if compared to back in 2018, it was only 2%. So things started moving within START Fund Bangladesh, at least. While we are doing that nudging and kind of bargaining with the international NGOs. We have delivered at least 2 of the commitments under the Workstream 6 on participation revolution. So we are currently serving as the technical co-lead of the localization working group under the Bangladesh Humanitarian Coordination Task Team, and delivered on improved representation and leadership of the local national NGOs at the level of the humanitarian country team, cluster, sector mechanisms. We have developed common standards and coordinated approach for accountability to affected populations to nudge community engagement, participation in humanitarian response. And we have developed common platform for sharing, analyzing data to strengthen decision-making, transparency, accountability, and limit duplication. So for example, we have developed pre-crisis data repository and promoted the use of digital platform like Hobo. We have delivered on the commitment one, sorry.
No, I didn't want to interrupt. Just maybe if you would agree that to conclude, you mentioned also the issue of ICR, maybe to explain for the non-experts on these issues, that the share of administrative funding going to local partners and not retained on the international level has increased, which is an important debate as well, how these funds are shared among actors. So if I get you right, I mean, it's very convincing what an interesting pilot program the START network is in Bangladesh, while in the overall framework it is a pilot project as we see so many in the Grand Bargain. But let me come back to you in a minute, and also when we will integrate the chat questions in a few minutes, and there are surely interesting ones for your very inspiring pilot. Sorg, can I quickly bring you in on the topic of NGOs as donors in the context of quality funding? In the analysis of the HPG for the Grand Bargain, even in 2020, you summarized large international NGOs have yet to accept localization and partnership approaches as this strategic way forward. That sounds like quite a fundamental critique on the role of major NGOs and networks they run. And some say it's reflected also in terms of quality funding, as the quality funding the NGOs get is not necessarily shared with their local partners. Is that still your analysis for the NGO sector and its role in this context?
Yeah, I mean, I think, first of all, to say that I think quality funding was, first of all, thought about primarily as something for donors and for UN organizations, because that was where the majority of funding goes. But I think what, Sajid put very well is that quality funding is not just about flexible funding, it's also about this core funding to institutions, which is so critical to the ability of national organizations being able to respond flexibly and to move quickly and to really deliver on the comparative advantages that they have. And what you hear from NGOs is that they themselves are not receiving sufficient multi-year funding or quality funding to pass this down. But the picture is, there isn't one picture. And so what we see, for instance, from perhaps more of the faith-based or solidarity organizations that have access to direct public funds and have a bit more flexibility, that actually those actors, CHS, Christian Aid, CAFOD, that they are actually extremely committed to quality funding. And so, for instance, Christian Aid have made a commitment now where they aim to pass 100% of their quality funding to national partners. I'm not sure if they're yet at the point where they're able to monitor and report at that, but that's a really significant commitment. And I think we need to see the same from some of the larger NGOs. And if they're not receiving the quality funding where they feel that they can pass that on to their national partners, they should be working with their donors to really advocate for that. And we have seen some moves. For instance, FCDO has put in new regulation that that their partners should be passing down some of that core funding down the line. So I think what it does raise questions for is where you see national actors and local actors playing, a comparatively more important role that there are real questions about, the role of INGOs and the value of INGOs and intermediaries, whether actually, what is their role in relation to some crises and in relation to ensuring that quality funding is providing enabling support for national actors who play such a central role.
Many thanks, Sorg.
So yeah, I guess that's the picture that I would paint.
Right. Many thanks. Maybe as a quick reaction, only before my colleague Sonia will share what we heard from the chat. Sajid, on this specific point, if government donors should fix that when they provide funds, it needs to be shared with local partners, a specific percentage, or if the commitment of NGO and UN agencies, the international ones, the partnership approach with locals should be a decisive factor to provide funds and to engage in these partnerships. Would you agree that would be should be a precondition for donor commitments and donor funding?
On the outset, it seems really nice that if there is a kind of fixed percentage, I say percentage, yes. But we also need to take into fact the difference between the global and the global north and the global south. So, for example, INGO headquarters in offshore headquarters in the global north takes 100% of the ICR with them. So, in fact, while we are working with the INGOs at the country level, we see that at least, in fact, no percent or very little percentage of the ICR is in fact, going to the South INGO country offices, which means that they are also left with no ICR to share with the member agencies while they are implementing partners. So yes, definitely that will work, but I think we also need to work in terms of the power imbalances of the global of the North and South INGO offices, because I really feel if we really wish to approach localization from a political perspective, it is very, very important that the Southern INGO offices also hold some of the powers, and so that those powers can be distributed and shared with the local organizations.
Many thanks, Sajid. Let me bring in Sonia, who will share what you have discussed in the chat, and then we will also have a quick look. You might remember, if you joined us yesterday, the graphic designer is supporting us over the course of the conference, and Nicolene in South Africa is putting down what we discuss here, and we will take a look in a minute what she has been drawing so far. But for now, let me ask Sonia to share what has been in the chat.
Many thanks, Ralf. I now have this very difficult job to streamline both questions from the chat for the opening panel as well as from the consecutive panel, especially also that the representative from the Foreign Office is no longer here to respond to them. But I will state some of the comments nonetheless. Many thanks also to Director General Sorg for the outline of the position of the Foreign Office and braving the discussion despite some of the technical issues that we had, that we sincerely apologize for. In the chat, there was an ongoing discussion about flexible funding and earmarking. And most of the comments indeed recognize the great achievements that the Foreign Office has done in flexibilizing funding, but also recognizing that issues are indeed more broader. For example, that excessive bureaucratic demands also come from more broader budgetary law and are not up to the Foreign Office alone, but also that, for example, more critically regarding NGOs specifically are really targeted by these unearmarked fundings, and that indeed there's 0% unearmarked funding indeed going to INGOs as of now, or that more than 88% is indeed tightly earmarked. However, with the two representatives of the ongoing panel, I would like to leave the questions of earmarking and flexible funding as for now, and turn to more a question of funding to local actors. I think that's a pretty big issue that will also feature in the Grant Barron 2.0 discussion. And with that, perhaps Sorcha, if you would like to take the first question, or envision some of the discussions that you have been part of, from your point of view, what will happen to the 25% target under the GB 2.0, as we've seen little progress with regard to more direct funding of local and national actors. So what do you see this happening in a future grant bargain? And then perhaps with Sajid, there was also several questions and a recognition that indeed Start Fund is doing a lot to increase funding, more direct funding to national and local actors. But the question to you, Sajid, would be what, if at all, is the role of the government of Bangladesh in the success story that you depict? And should, for example, governments engage with donors to promote direct funding to local actors more directly? With that, I'd hang back to you.
Thanks, Sonja. Sajid, maybe we start with the last question. What's the role of the government of Bangladesh, and how do you see interaction on this front?
All right, thank you. So before going to that particular point, I think we also need to make it very, very clear that Start Fund Bangladesh is a civil society managed full funding mechanism. Yeah. And then when we talk about, we talk a lot about, shrinking political space of the civil society. So we have to be very, very clear in terms of our engagement with the government, whether the government occupy the space of the civil society. So that's very, very important. Yes, because the decisions are being made by the local, national, international member organizations who are part of the platform. So how we keep intact that decision-making space, but at the same time can engage strategically with the national government. So the way we engage with the government, as I was saying, that we are kind of approaching through the humanitarian coordination task team, the national task team that we have, that combines and brings together the UN, government, NGOs, and NGOs from the local level, and using that platform to influence the government. Now, in terms of the kind of evidence we have generated, and also kind of, showing in terms of rapidness, in terms of more value for money reaching to communities. So that evidence is there with us. It was not there with us back in 2017. So we have now that with us. And gradually through the local organizations, because the local organizations has the legitimate voice and the kind of mandate for advocacy on behalf of the local community. So definitely through the platform, the Humanitarian Coordination Task Team, we are now proceeding on some of the advocacy issues. In terms of the evidence, as we were talking about pool funding mechanism, so there are also experimentations done by different agencies, for example, like Oxfam through their ELNA project. They are now trying to come up with a model for the district level. So how at the local government level that can be decided, and some of the local government funding can be generated for those, the local level pool funding mechanism. So yes, I think there is also a role from the donor because of their kind of bilateral, multilateral relationship with the government to also kind of use these evidence to influence the government. So that there is an allocation from the government funding. And what we also kind of always try to think and try to remember that localization cannot be done with donor money. It has to be done with local money. You have to have the kind of ownership. And Bangladesh, for example, becoming a middle income country, which means that we will have less and less of the humanitarian funding or the development funding in coming days. And which means that the government need to take more of the stake and also the private sector organizations. So yes, the advocacy is there, but we have to be very, very careful. So for example, if we invite government for Start Fund mechanisms, then whether that will be obstructing the civil society participation space. So these things need to be sorted out, and we have to be a bit strategic and careful. Over.
Many thanks, Sajid. Very interesting point. I'm happy also to transfer to Sorcha on the question addressed to you. Is the key question rather where the local funding is coming from and governments and host governments engage more, while we keep talking about all this direct or indirect funding coming from the international humanitarian world? So what would that mean for the 25% goal to be shared by international agencies, etc.? Is this a key question for the future, or what would be your approach on how to engage in the localization debate in a future Grand Bargain 2.0?
So where we are currently on the 25% is our report shows that of the 53 grant giving signatories, 12 of them have reported that they've met or exceeded that 25%. So it's less than a quarter. So clearly there hasn't been the achievement that was hoped for. And if you look at where we are in terms of FTS data, it's just 4.7% of all global funds in 2020 that went directly to national and local responders. So I think there can be movement on that. On this kind of volume of direct funding. But I think as Sajid mentioned, that perhaps that question of direct funding is important, but it's also that the quality of that funding, and that we have to make sure that there is a move away from project funding to more institutional core funding to national and local partners. And whether that comes directly or whether it comes from country-based pooled funds, the key question is, that quality, and also more generally in terms of the degree to which local and national actors can access not just the funding, but those kind of wider dimensions of participation in decision-making, representation, and leadership ability. So I think, I think it's an open question as to whether that target will remain. But I do think that the focus needs to be broader than just on that target, because there are ways of getting quality funding to national actors, as the START mechanism demonstrates. That's incredibly valuable for those actors that may not be direct. And while I think we can look at the START network and that 78% that's going to national and local actors and be very impressed by that, there has been some move on some of the UN mechanisms as well. And so, for instance, on country-based pool funds, CHA is reporting that that 39% of the funding from country-based pool fundings is going to national and local actors, up from 25%. And we had a pilot SURF last year that was aimed at giving direct support to NGOs on the ground, and a third of that went to national and local actors. So, I mean, I think we need to look at all of these mechanisms, but we need to not just look at the volume of funding. We need to look at what type of funding, and whether it's that quality funding that ensures that we have, sustainable national and local actors that can make strategic choices based on their own contextual knowledge on where to respond, and they have predictable and flexible funding to do that well.
Many thanks, Sorcha. I don't know if you have a chance to look at our graphic designer's output for a second before we jump into a second round, or maybe meanwhile we jump into a second round of questions from the chat. Sonja, maybe you want to continue and share what you've heard, while we might have a chance to look at what Nicoline in South Africa is drawing.
Yeah, many thanks. So indeed, the comments link up nicely with what was just discussed, really more that there was a comment of the impressive record that START Bangladesh has in comparison also to the UN country-based pooled funds. And just perhaps, Sajid, you could share some learnings that you make in enabling that direct access to local and national NGOs, perhaps just as a reaction to that comment. And Sorg, there was also this discussion earlier on the role of needs assessment and joint needs assessment. And there was a comment regarding that donors don't do needs assessments themselves, but they push for better and more joined up needs assessments. And if there should be a similar process as the 8+3 for reporting to harmonize assessment and accept the assessment results among donors, what would be your take, Sorg? How hopeful would you be that such a process would indeed be valuable for that? With that, over to you.
Many thanks, Sonja. Maybe, Sorg, this time we start with you. Any quick reaction to the question from the chat?
Yeah, I mean, I think needs assessments are very important. I'm not sure that it's going to be the central focus of Grand Bargain 2.0, which I think will focus more on quality funding and the different elements that would feed into that. So I think while there is recognition that there needs to be joint needs analysis and that donors and agencies need to support these, and on the part of agencies participate in them. But I don't think that's where the real drive is going to be for Grand Bargain 2.0. I mean, maybe just a point on that next iteration of the Grand Bargain. It is only 2 years, and I think it's right that that there is a focus down on quality funding, on local humanitarian action, and on participation. I think we need to be moving and thinking very quickly about a longer term agenda. Where as humanitarians, we're always used to short cycles and expecting change within 2 years. And we'll only get so far in 2 years, and it's taking 6 months to agree the focus of the next Grand Bargain 2.0. Even the Grand Bargain itself was just one pillar of the humanitarian the high-level panel on humanitarian financing, and we've kind of kicked down the road the whole question of reducing need and widening the resource base. And I would argue that at the same time as we're moving into Grand Bargain 2.0, we should be thinking now about a much more ambitious and longer-term process of change that's 5 to 10 years, and that we're pushing other agendas alongside the efficiency and effectiveness through the Grand Bargain, alongside these wider agendas, and should be thinking about the kind of political change, because I think things like localization and participation are real political agendas, and they need that political energy and commitment. And we're all arguing that the Grand Bargain should get more political, but not just for the next 2 years. There needs to be a process of change that goes beyond just 2 years, and we're thinking through what's the change we want to see in 5 to 10 years, and how can we get momentum and energy towards that agenda. Because we're very quickly going to be coming out of this next 2-year Grand Bargain and having these debates again. And we should be, really pushing towards longer term ambition at this point.
Many thanks, Sorg. Maybe Sajid, and if you had to name one key learning from Bangladesh Start Network before we start our final round and you have a final word on this debate, what would be the number one learning everybody should remember after this?
I think it's about having trust on the mechanism and having trust on the power of the local frontline humanitarian actors, and also having trust in the power of collectiveness and the power of collaborations, and also having trust even on our own self, and having the confidence of making change. And we should not be waiting for change. We should be change makers, everyone.
Many thanks, Sajid. That was very clear. Maybe I give you the floor also for a final word. There is a lot of talk that we need more pressure, that we need more incentives for change, etc. And you have apparently very encouraging hopes that things can change. Where could these incentives come from? What gives you hope that the Grand Bargain 2.0 or the whole overall humanitarian reform process can move in the right direction and with a needed dynamic?
Thank you. I mean, the grand bargain can be green bargain, yes, if we do not stop following the business as usual and if we do not initiate reform immediately. So what are some of the reform agenda and what is the most important reform agenda for me at this point of time and from my realization? So if I look at the system now, that kind of lion's share of the world emergency aid spending is occupied by a handful of around 30 donors and aid agencies, and which means that it will not in fact disrupt the power dynamics in the system. It will rather concentrate the power dynamics. And what we see that the bilateral donors channeling the bulk of their budgets through large multilateral UN agencies, which is not also a good enough strategy to influence UN reforms. So when we are talking about Start Fund, we are in fact talking about the tip of the iceberg. Yes, it's very little amount of money, 10 million pounds for 4 years. But we want to see more and more of these kind of pool funding mechanisms or investment in pool funding mechanisms. So the channeling of the fund need to be diversified. It should be inspiring and incentivizing local leadership, risk sharing, encourage capacity convergence among local national NGOs, international NGOs, UN agencies, while UN organizations are contributing more from technical and coordination capacities. So UN becoming implementing entity can be also a problem if I see myself, from my experiences, that if we really wish to see a reform in the sector. So for example, if the UN SURF pool fund is doubled to USD 1 billion by 2020, we should have serious discussions, to opening up the access to the national NGOs and non-UN pool funds like the Start Fund mechanisms. The other thing, I think it's a bit of gray area, which is around due diligence. Yes, we need it, but can donor agree to a common set of indicators, and can we pursue a common due diligence passporting system and framework? Because NGOs are, they are fed up with, doing DDA for each and every project they have to access. So how we can come to a decisions in those few aspects, I think is very, very important. Over.
Final words. Sorcha, before I give you the floor for a final word, and on the question if the system can change, how can it change? Can it change from within? Let me quote your think tank. 20 years ago, ODI published something on the cultures in the humanitarian system. I quote, "The competition for funds exacerbates institutional cultures that foster agency alliance over system-wide loyalty. It fosters cultures where staff commitment to coordinated outcomes is neither required nor rewarded." Is that still an issue today? And if so, what would you hope where more pressure, as you just mentioned yourself, more political incentives would come to real reform?
So absolutely, I think it's still the same. And you only have to look at the cash coordination mechanism to see how institutional interests have trumped a commitment to something that everyone sees as necessary to move forward on cash. So I think those same issues are persistent and they will remain the same. And so I guess I would point to a few things. I think the first thing, the Grand Bargain has been, to date, largely driven by policy and technical experts. They've done fantastic, in some places, work, but I think it's time to get political, and it needs to elevate it up to the principles of the large agencies to actually move forward and drive forward the change, informed, of course, by their expert policy advisors and at the technical level. But we need to see that change, and we particularly need to see the change amongst the larger actors if we're going to see the systemic change. So I think we're all convinced that the grand bargain needs to be more inclusive, but we need to be careful that that doesn't take the spotlight away from the need for larger actors to move. I think we need to move away from this quid pro quo deal and get into constituencies of champions, where if we see, for instance, UNHCR move forward unilaterally on multi-year funding and flexibility to its partners. So maybe if we can find UNHCR, others to champion on a particular agenda, to drive it forward with donors, with UN and NGOs, both international and national actors working together as a kind of an alliance rather than this quid pro quo deal. I think that's really important. Quality funding, I think there's opportunities to really hone in on which actors are providing value in the system and make sure the quality funding is reaching them rather than this kind of idea that we cascade it through the system. And the last thing that I would really emphasize is that we don't focus just on, the important but limited elements of the grand bargain. And we're thinking much more long-term, and we're having a more ambitious agenda around those other elements that were in the high-level panel for humanitarian financing. So that's where I see, the need now to move in terms of grand bargain 2.0.
Thank you so much, Sorg. Thank you so much, Sajid, for this really inspiring, even encouraging panel. I hear from you, Sorg, for example, you also think about extending the grand bargain maybe even to 2030, like the Sustainable Development Goals, and to align this, as we discussed yesterday, and to have a really multi-year approach also on the reform sector itself. Thank you so much. It has been really interesting. We have to close now. Apologies for the hiccups in the beginning, and thank you so much for making this a really running panel in this part. Thanks for joining us. Stay with us if you can, and same to you in the audience. We will continue in less than 30 minutes, jumping on the spotlight sessions on gender, on innovation, and on ethics. So please stay with us. And in the break, if you wish, we will share again the graphic, which tries to conclude a bit what we discussed in the past 90 minutes. And then we will move on for the second part of this day. Thank you, Sorg. Please join us next time again. Thank you, Sajid. It has been a great pleasure, and have a good day.
Rolf.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Rolf. Thank you, Sorg, and thanks to all the audience.
Bye, Sajid.
Bye-bye.